President Trump is winding down his 12-day, five-nation trip to Asia by, among other things, meeting with a controversial leader accused of abusing human rights. On the surface, at least, it was all pleasantries between Mr. Trump and his host, Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte.
We've had a great relationship. This has been very successful.
Up for discussion, trade and fighting terrorism. In public, at least, President Trump did not mention Duterte's bloody crackdown on drug suspects. Philippines officials estimate more than 3,000 people have died. Human rights groups say it is 3 times that many. Duterte has even boasted of killing men with his own hands when he was younger. After today's meeting, White House spokeswoman Sarah Sanders said human rights briefly came up in the context of the Philippines' fight against illegal drugs. A spokesman for Duterte denied that Mr. Trump ever raised the issue.
Well, there was no mention of human rights. There was no mention of extralegal killings. There was only a rather lengthy discussion about the Philippine war on drugs.
The leaders ignored reporters' questions. Duterte called them spies, drawing laughter from President Trump. Reactions were sharply different in the streets. Hundreds of people protested the Trump visit, and police beat them back with shields and water cannons. Duterte, though, seemed unfazed. Last night, he even broke into song for his guest of honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, President Duterte. I sang uninvited a duet with Ms. Pilita Corrales upon the orders of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States.
Still, there are differences. Today, Mr. Trump addressed leaders of ASEAN, a bloc of Southeast Asian nations, hoping they will help counter China's influence. President Duterte is seeking closer ties with China. At a forum yesterday, he called it the #1 economic power.
The South China Sea is better left untouched. Nobody can afford to go to war.
Over the weekend, President Trump drew fire for his embrace of another strong man, Russia's President Vladimir Putin. They spoke during a summit of Asian Pacific leaders in Vietnam. Afterward, the president was asked if he pressed Putin on Russia's meddling in the 2016 election. He answered that every time he sees me, he says, "I didn't do that," and I really believe that when he tells me that. Mr. Trump also said U.S. intelligence agency leaders who had confirmed Russian meddling were, quote, political hacks. But on Sunday, he said he was talking about previous agency heads.
I'm with our agencies, especially as currently constituted with their leadership. I believe in our intel agencies.
Tomorrow, the president attends an East Asia summit meeting in Manila, concluding his Asia tour. We take a closer look at the trip and what message Mr. Trump is sending to the region with Richard Haass. He served in Republican administrations on the National Security Council staff and in the State Department. He's now the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book is A World in Disarray. And Michael Pillsbury is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he directs the Center for Chinese Strategy. He was also an advisor to the Trump transition. And welcome to both of you. Welcome back to the program. Michael Pillsbury, to you first. What is the main thing the president has accomplished on this trip?
I think there's 2 or 3 things. The main thing is to lay the foundation for his next trip next year. He's laid the foundation in each of these 5 countries. He's taken very seriously the 3 multilateral organizations that he met with. He's also integrated trade and security in a very unique way that has not been done for a long time. If you look at his team in some of these meetings, not only has Secretary of State Tillerson, he's also got Bob Lighthizer from USTR. So it's a unique combination of trade and security put together. It comes out also in some of the bilateral agreements with the 5 governments.
Richard Haass, how do you see the accomplishments on the trip so far?
Well, the principal accomplishment in the spirit of Woody Allen was showing up. The fact that the President of the United States went to 5 countries, spent nearly 2 weeks, showed up at all these meetings. I think that says that Asia is important to us. This was, however, in part undone by his own lack of discipline. You mentioned some of the things in your introduction. The kind treatment of the illiberal, to say the least, president of the Philippines, the statements about Mr. Putin, the trashing of former American intelligence officials, all this detracted from the trip. And where I disagree with Michael Pillsbury fundamentally is the president, rather than integrating security and trade, if anything, divorced the two. And historians will say, I will predict, the principal decision of the trip was to further distance the United States from the dynamism in the region, to keep the United States outside the multilateral trade mechanism. And the principal beneficiary of that is China, as our allies and friends are essentially left to their own devices.
Well, let's take those one at a time. Michael Pillsbury, what about his first, Richard Haass's first point, that the president, with all these comments flattering the strong men, cozying up to people who have not been seen as friendly to the U.S., that really hurt the overall effort to get something done?
Human rights was mentioned in the bilateral statement between the Philippines and the United States. So it's a little bit unfair for Richard to say, you know, be as harsh as he is. This is a first time out, and I completely agree with invoking Woody Allen that 90% of life is just showing up. But it's more than that. He got some agreements. When I mentioned trade and economics being integrated, I'm talking about the businessmen who showed up in Beijing with a promised $250 billion in deals. The businessmen were part of each of the stops. So it cannot be denied that Trump is trying to integrate trade and investment with security issues. I think also it's important that he laid out an exit ramp for the leader of North Korea.
Well, let me stop you there. I want to come back to Richard on that point about trade and security, and then we'll come back to North Korea. Richard, what about that?
Deals are not the answer. A lot of these deals in part represented previous agreements. They then may take 5, 10, 15 years to really come to fruition. That's going to then make the size of them quite insignificant. The real economic opportunity was to integrate the United States in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It would have set very high standards for the region. China is not a part of it, and it would have forced China to make a decision. Stay outside the region economically or join it, but join it on terms that we want, that they have to open up to investment and trade, that they can't demand certain types of technology transfer, they can't steal technology. So we had this mechanism which we helped negotiate, and then Mr. Trump has walked away from it.
So did the U.S. lose ground with regard to China in Asia?
No, I don't think so. I understand Richard Haass's criticism of walking away from TPP. I think what the president has in mind is replacing it in two ways. One is some sort of benefit from TPP. It's not entirely dropped. Some aspects of it can be incorporated in the new framework, which is bilateral agreements with each of these major trading nations. The other thing I need to remind Richard Haass of is an excellent book he once wrote called Reluctant Sheriff. He has the concept in that book of ripeness or ripening, when an issue is ready to be settled. It's a very important thing in geopolitics to know when it's time to do something. Right now, it's time to move toward more bilateral trade agreements that are fairer to us. It's also time to talk about North Korea, which he did at every stop, but in a much more measured way than some of the military threats that had been used earlier. In fact, there's very little discussion of a sort of an attack on North Korea during the trip. I think that's a good thing.
Richard Haass, what about the North Korea point, and then about the trade, whether the timing is right?
And about this great book, The Reluctant Sheriff.
It's impossible to criticize someone who says nice things about something you've written. But let me come to North Korea. That's obviously the most urgent national security threat, not just in the region, but the world. The president, I think, erred by some of his public tweeting and so forth. But privately, the real question is, over time, did he line up Japan, South Korea, and most important, China, to work with us more on putting pressure on North Korea? And even more, I think the question will be, Judy, is the United States now prepared to introduce an element of diplomacy? The choices are essentially living with North Korea with a large missile and nuclear inventory. That is not desirable. Going to war with North Korea, also not desirable. So why not introduce a serious diplomatic dimension? It won't eliminate the problem, but it could cap and stabilize it and create a baseline. I don't see that yet. I'm hoping, and again, this is one trip. I realize it's not an entire foreign policy. We'll have to look back on it one day. I'm hoping that ultimately gets introduced.
Well, we are going to have an opportunity in the future to look back at this. We want to thank both of you, both the promoter of the book and the author himself. Richard Haass, Michael Pillsbury, thank you both.
Richard's being too harsh on President Trump. That's my final view.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you.